I thought I knew what family meant, a bond unbreakable, untouchable. But that summer night, alone with my brothers, everything I believed came crashing down. What started as a game spiraled into something I still can't wrap my head around. When the lines blurred, we crossed into a place I never thought we'd go. If I had just walked away. But I didn't. And now, nothing will ever be the same. The summer before everything changed was supposed to be just another chapter of my life. A fleeting moment before college whisked me away to new beginnings. It was a time of sticky, humid days and quiet nights when even the cicadas seemed to whisper in the silence. My parents had taken one of their rare trips to rekindle their marriage, leaving the three of us, Jake, Ryan, and me, alone in the house. Jake, my older brother, was 22. He had always been the epitome of effortless confidence. With his sharp wit and an unshakable smirk, he was the one everyone wanted to be around. Then there was Ryan, the youngest of us at 19. Reserved and introspective, his quiet demeanor often masked how deeply he observed the world around him. And me, stuck in the middle at 21, I was the mediator, the peacemaker, the glue that held our wildly different personalities together. Our relationships had always been close, closer than most siblings even, but there was nothing unusual about that. We shared laughs, bantered, and teased one another relentlessly. That dynamic was our normal, our comfort zone. But something shifted that summer. The first 2 days passed uneventfully, the house too quiet for its own good. Jake lounged on the couch, flipping through TV channels, while Ryan buried himself in his books. I floated somewhere in between, trying to ward off the oppressive boredom. By the third night, the monotony had taken its toll. At the dining table, Jake leaned back in his chair, tossing a pizza crust onto his plate. "This house is way too quiet," he said, his voice cutting through the stillness. "We need to do something." His suggestion seemed innocent enough. Play a game, watch a movie, anything to shake off the restlessness that had begun to set in. It wasn't unusual for Jake to push us into doing something together. He always had this way of rallying us, making the mundane seem exciting. But there was something in his tone, an edge I couldn't quite place. That night, we let our guard down. It was just supposed to be fun, a way to connect. None of us knew the storm that was brewing just beneath the surface. As the days wore on, the dynamic between us began to shift in ways I couldn't fully understand, or didn't want to. At first, it was small things. Jake lingering in the room a little longer than necessary, or Ryan watching me with a quiet intensity he'd never shown before. The house, which had once been a haven of routine and predictability, started to feel different. Charged. It was subtle at first. Jake's teasing felt sharper, his jokes carrying a weight I couldn't pinpoint. "You've been quiet lately," he said one afternoon, his smirk softened by an uncharacteristic seriousness. "Thinking about your big college adventure?" I laughed it off, but the way his eyes lingered made my pulse quicken. Ryan was different, too. Always reserved, his quiet demeanor had turned almost brooding. His eyes would meet mine across the room and hold my gaze for just a second too long. I told myself it was nothing, a figment of my imagination born from boredom and too much time spent cooped up together. But as the days turned into nights, the feeling only grew stronger. That third evening, Jake rallied us for a movie night. He picked some ridiculous action flick, and though I wanted to roll my eyes, I found myself laughing more than I had in weeks. The three of us sprawled out in the living room, the glow of the TV casting flickering shadows on the walls. Jake leaned back on the couch, his arm casually brushing against mine as he stretched. It should have meant nothing, but it didn't. By the time the credits rolled, the air in the room felt heavier. The laughter had softened, giving way to something quieter, more intimate. Jake tossed a throw pillow at me, his smirk back in full force. "Your turn to entertain us," he said, his tone playful. "Pick something we won't hate." I hesitated, glancing at Ryan. He was watching me, his expression unreadable. "I don't know," I said, shrugging. "I'm fine just sitting here." Jake rolled his eyes. "Lame," he teased. But the way he looked at me, something unspoken flickering in his eyes, made my chest tighten. "How about a game?" he suggested, his voice lighter now. "Something classic. Truth or dare?" Ryan chuckled, shaking his head. "We're not 12, Jake." "Exactly." Jake grinned, his mischievous energy filling the room. "Let's do it for real. No chickening out. You in?" I hesitated, unsure of what to say. Ryan's eyes met mine, and in that moment, I felt the weight of the decision pressing down on me. "Fine," I said finally, forcing a laugh. "But I'm not going easy on either of you." The game started innocently enough, embarrassing truths, silly dares, but it didn't take long for the questions to grow bolder. The dares became riskier, the tension between us building with each passing round. Jake leaned into his role as instigator, his questions laced with playful provocation. "Truth or dare?" he asked me at one point, his voice low and steady. "Truth," I said, crossing my arms. He smirked. "What's the most intimate thought you've had about someone in this room?" My cheeks burned, and I laughed nervously, brushing off the question with a sarcastic quip. But the weight of his gaze stayed with me, the unspoken challenge lingering in the air. And Ryan, he was quiet, but his presence was palpable. His eyes held a question I couldn't answer, one that made my chest tighten and my thoughts spiral. By the time the game ended, the mood in the room had shifted completely. The laughter had faded, replaced by a tension that neither of them seemed willing to acknowledge. I went to bed that night unable to shake the feeling that something had changed between us, something I couldn't ignore. And deep down, I wasn't sure if I wanted to. The night after our game of truth or dare, I woke up with an inexplicable restlessness. The house was quiet, the stillness almost oppressive, but my thoughts were loud, refusing to let me settle. The echoes of laughter, lingering looks, and the subtle brushes of Jake's and Ryan's presence from the night before played over and over in my mind. Something had changed, and no matter how much I tried to dismiss it, I couldn't. By the afternoon, Jake suggested we do something to shake off the monotony. "Let's play cards or something," he said, his tone casual, but his eyes held that familiar spark of mischief. Ryan looked up from his book, his brows furrowed, but he didn't protest. I hesitated before agreeing, not wanting to be the one who broke the tentative camaraderie that had formed between us. We gathered in the living room, sitting cross-legged on the floor around the coffee table. The game was simple enough, poker with no real stakes, but Jake, of course, found a way to make it interesting. "Let's make it a little more fun," he said, leaning back against the couch. "Loser has to answer a question. No exceptions." Ryan raised an eyebrow, his lips twitching into a half-smile. "Isn't that just truth or dare again?" "Not quite," Jake replied with a shrug. "No dares this time. Just truths." "Deal." I hesitated, but Ryan shrugged, his quiet acceptance easing my apprehension. "Deal," I said finally. The game started lighthearted, the questions harmless at first. But as the rounds passed and we grew more comfortable, or maybe just more reckless, the questions started to dig deeper. Jake asked Ryan about his first kiss, teasing him mercilessly when he admitted it had been awkward and short-lived. Ryan retaliated by asking Jake about an embarrassing moment at one of his college parties, earning laughter from both of us when Jake recounted a drunken mishap involving a borrowed scooter and a mailbox. Then it was my turn. I'd lost the round, and Jake wasted no time with his question. "What's the most unexpected thing you've ever felt for someone?" His tone was light, but his eyes betrayed his curiosity. My breath caught, and for a moment I couldn't speak. My mind raced, the words tangled in my throat as both Jake and Ryan watched me intently. I don't know," I stammered finally, forcing a laugh. "I guess admiration? Like when someone surprises you by being better than you thought they were." Jake tilted his head, his smirk softening into something more thoughtful. "Fair enough," he said, though I could feel the weight of his gaze lingering. Ryan's turn came next, and Jake wasted no time with his question. "Who's the one person you'd risk everything for?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost serious. Ryan hesitated, his gaze flicking to me for the briefest moment before he looked away. "I don't know," he said finally. But the way his hands tightened around his cards, the tension in his jaw, I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't being entirely truthful. The game ended shortly after, the questions and laughter tapering off as the atmosphere grew heavier. By the time we called it a night, the unspoken tension between us was almost unbearable. Later that night, as I sat on my bed trying to make sense of the growing feelings I couldn't ignore, there was a soft knock at my door. "Come in," I said hesitantly, and Jake stepped inside, his usual confidence tempered by something quieter. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. I nodded, but the weight in my chest made it hard to meet his eyes. "You seem off," he said, sitting on the edge of my bed. I wanted to check on you." "I'm fine," I said, forcing a smile. But when he reached out and took my hand, his touch warm and steady, I felt my resolve waver. His eyes held mine, searching for something I wasn't sure I could give. "Are you?" he asked quietly. Before I could answer, the door creaked open again, and Ryan stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Am I interrupting?" he asked, his voice steady, but there was an edge to it I couldn't ignore. "No," Jake said, his tone casual but firm. Come in. Ryan stepped inside, his presence shifting the energy in the room. The air felt charged, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as both of them looked at me. What's going on? Ryan asked, his eyes flicking between Jake and me. Just talking, Jake said, leaning back slightly but not letting go of my hand. Ryan's gaze lingered on our joined hands, and something in his expression softened. Right, he said, his tone quieter now. The silence that followed was deafening, the weight of everything unspoken pressing down on us. I didn't know what to say, how to diffuse the tension that was building between them, or within myself. All I knew was that in that moment, the lines between us had blurred beyond recognition. The next evening, the tension between us reached a boiling point. It wasn't any one thing that pushed us there, it was the culmination of countless small moments. Lingering glances, quiet touches, and the electric charge that seemed to hum between us whenever we were in the same room. The unspoken feelings that had been simmering beneath the surface could no longer be ignored. We were in the living room again, sprawled out on the couch. Jake had picked another cheesy action movie, and though we tried to act as if nothing had changed, the atmosphere was different. Charged. Jake sat on one side of me, his arm draped casually across the back of the couch, while Ryan was on the other, his leg brushing against mine as he shifted. Every touch, no matter how small, felt magnified, as if the room itself was holding its breath. I'm grabbing drinks, Jake said suddenly, standing up and stretching. Anyone want something? I shook my head, but Ryan nodded. Sure, he said, his voice quieter than usual. As Jake disappeared into the kitchen, the silence between Ryan and me grew heavier. He shifted closer, his gaze meeting mine, and I felt my pulse quicken. You've been quiet, he said softly, his voice steady but filled with an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite place. I'm fine, I replied, forcing a smile that I hoped would ease the tension. But his eyes searched mine, as if he could see through the facade. Are you? He asked, echoing Jake's question from the night before. There was something in his tone, a vulnerability that made my chest tighten. Before I could respond, Jake returned, 2 beers in hand. He paused in the doorway, his gaze flicking between us, and I saw something shift in his expression. What's going on here? He asked, his tone light, but his eyes betrayed his curiosity. Nothing, Ryan said quickly, leaning back slightly. But Jake wasn't convinced. He set the beers down on the coffee table and crossed his arms, his smirk fading into something more serious. You sure about that? He asked, his eyes locking onto mine. Because it doesn't look like nothing. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. The weight of their gazes, the tension that had been building for days, it was all too much. Jake, I started, my voice trembling, but he cut me off with a quiet laugh. You know, he said, his tone thoughtful, I've been thinking. About us. About this. He gestured vaguely between the 3 of us, his smirk returning but tinged with something darker. Why are we pretending we don't all feel it? Ryan stiffened beside me, his jaw tightening. Jake, don't, he said, his voice low and tense. Don't what? Jake shot back, his gaze flicking to his younger brother. Say what we're all thinking. What's the point of tiptoeing around it? This is insane, I whispered, shaking my head. But my voice lacked the conviction I so desperately needed it to have. Is it? Jake asked, leaning forward. His usual bravado was gone, replaced by a quiet intensity that made my heart race. Because if it is, then tell me. Tell me you don't feel it. I looked at him, then at Ryan. Their eyes were on me, waiting, and I felt like the weight of the entire world was pressing down on my chest. I wanted to deny it, to laugh it off and put an end to the madness. But I couldn't. The truth was there, undeniable, and it terrified me. I don't know, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what I feel. Jake leaned back, his smirk softening. That's not a no. Ryan shifted beside me, his hand brushing against mine in a way that sent shivers down my spine. This isn't right, he said, his voice quieter now. We can't. Why not? Jake interrupted, his tone calm but firm. Who's stopping us? It's just us. No one else. No one to judge. No one to tell us what we can or can't do. Ryan's jaw tightened, and I could feel the tension radiating off him. That doesn't make it right, he said. But it doesn't make it wrong either, Jake countered, his gaze steady. Not if we all want it. The room fell silent, the weight of his words pressing down on us. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My heart was racing, my thoughts a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't untangle. Stop, I said finally, my voice trembling. Just stop. Jake's gaze softened, his usual confidence replaced by something quieter, more vulnerable. We'll stop if that's what you want, he said. But I need to know. Is that what you want? I looked at him, then at Ryan. Their eyes were on me, filled with a mixture of longing and uncertainty. I wanted to say no, to put an end to whatever this was before it spiraled further out of control. But the truth was, I didn't know what I wanted. All I knew was that in that moment, the lines between us had blurred beyond recognition. I don't know, I whispered, my voice trembling. I don't know what I want. Ryan's hand tightened around mine, his touch grounding me in a way that felt both comforting and overwhelming. It's okay, he said softly. You don't have to decide right now. Jake leaned back, running a hand through his hair. We don't have to rush this, he said, his voice quieter now. But let's stop pretending it's not there. The room fell silent again, the weight of their words settling over us like a heavy blanket. I felt my breath hitch, my chest tightening as I glanced between them. There was no judgment in their eyes, no pressure, just an unspoken understanding that whatever this was, we were in it together. The morning after that fateful night, the house felt different. The usual sense of routine and comfort had been replaced by a heavy silence. The sunlight streaming through the windows seemed too bright, too intrusive, as if even the world outside was aware of the shift between us. I woke up first, my thoughts a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't make sense of. Regret? Guilt? Longing? They all churned within me, a tangled mess I didn't know how to unravel. The memories of the night before played on a loop in my mind. The looks, the touches, the unspoken words that had finally been voiced. I wanted to tell myself it was nothing, that we could go back to the way things were, but deep down, I knew that was a lie. Jake was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, his usual confident demeanor subdued. He glanced up as I entered, his expression unreadable. Morning, he said, his voice quiet. Morning, I replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. The tension between us was palpable, a heavy weight neither of us seemed willing to address. Ryan joined us a few minutes later, his gaze avoiding mine as he poured himself a cup of coffee. The silence that followed was deafening, the three of us sitting in the same room, yet feeling miles apart. It was Jake who finally broke it. So, he said, his tone light but forced, what's the plan for today? Plan? Ryan echoed, his voice sharper than intended. I think the plan is to pretend last night didn't happen. Jake's jaw tightened, and he set his coffee cup down with a little too much force. Is that what you want? He asked, his gaze locking onto Ryan's. What I want, Ryan said, his tone low and measured, is to not destroy everything. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. My chest tightened, and I glanced between them, unsure of how to diffuse the tension that was quickly escalating. Enough, I said finally, my voice trembling. We can't, I paused, taking a shaky breath. We can't keep doing this. Jake's expression softened, and he leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. Doing what? He asked, his voice quieter now. Being honest. Ryan's gaze snapped to him, his jaw clenching. Honest? This isn't about honesty, Jake. This is about crossing lines we can't uncross. I felt my throat tighten, the weight of their words pressing down on me. He's right, I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. We can't go back. But we can't go forward either. The silence that followed was suffocating, each of us grappling with the consequences of what had happened. I could feel the tears welling in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I couldn't let myself break, not here, not now. Jake stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. If that's how you feel, he said, his voice sharp, then maybe we should just forget about it. Pretend it never happened. Ryan's expression darkened, and he stood as well, his fists clenched at his sides. That's easy for you to say, he shot back. But what happens when we can't? What happens when this comes back to haunt us? I stood too, my hands trembling as I tried to steady my voice. Stop it, I said, my tone firmer now. Both of you. This isn't helping. They both turned to me, their gazes filled with a mixture of frustration and something deeper. Something I didn't want to name. What do you want us to do? Jake asked, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. I don't know, I admitted, the words breaking on a sob I couldn't hold back. I don't know what to do. Jake's expression softened, and he reached out as if to comfort me, but I stepped back. No, I said, shaking my head. We need space. All of us. Ryan looked away, his jaw tightening as he crossed his arms over his chest. Fine, he said, his voice strained. If that's what you want. It's not about what I want, I said, my voice trembling. It's about what's right. The room fell silent again, the weight of my words pressing down on all of us. Jake exhaled heavily, running a hand through his hair as he nodded. Okay, he said finally. Space. Ryan didn't say anything, his silence speaking volumes as he turned and walked out of the room. Jake followed a moment later, leaving me alone in the kitchen, my thoughts a chaotic mess. I sank into a chair, my hands trembling as I tried to process everything that had happened. The weight of the night before, the tension of the morning, it was all too much. For the rest of the day, we avoided each other, the house eerily quiet as we retreated to our own corners. The distance was suffocating, but it was what we needed. By the time night fell, I knew things would never be the same. The bond we had once shared, the closeness that had always been our strength, had been irreparably changed. And yet, as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but wonder, could we ever find a way back to each other? Or had we crossed a line that would forever keep us apart? The days that followed were heavy with unspoken words and unfinished thoughts. The house felt too quiet, the walls seeming to echo the weight of our shared silence. We avoided each other, retreating to separate corners of the house, as if physical distance could undo the emotional closeness we had crossed into. But no amount of space could erase the tension that lingered between us, nor could it change what had already happened. I spent most of my time in my room, replaying everything over and over in my mind. The moments we'd shared, the words we hadn't said, the feelings I couldn't untangle, they consumed me. Guilt and shame warred with something softer, something that whispered of longing and regret. But above all, there was the fear. Fear of what we had done, what it meant, and how it had changed us. Jake was the first to break the silence. One evening, as the sun set and the house was bathed in a soft, golden light, he knocked on my door. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice subdued. I hesitated before nodding, motioning for him to come in. He sat at the edge of my bed, his usual confidence replaced by a quiet vulnerability. "I've been thinking," he began, his gaze fixed on his hands. "About what happened. About us." My chest tightened, and I forced myself to meet his eyes. "Jake, we can't." "I know," he said quickly, cutting me off. "I know we can't go back. And I know we can't stay where we are. But I don't want to lose you. Not as my sister, not as family." His words hit me like a tidal wave, and I felt the tears welling in my eyes. "I don't want to lose you either," I whispered, my voice trembling. "But I don't know how to fix this." "We don't have to fix it," he said softly. "We just have to move forward. Together." A part of me wanted to believe him, to trust that we could find a way to heal. But the scars of what we'd done felt too deep, the weight of our choices too heavy. "Do you think we'll ever be okay again?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Jake's gaze softened and he reached out, taking my hand in his. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I think we have to try." Ryan joined us later that night. He knocked quietly before stepping into the room, his expression hesitant but resolute. "I want to talk," he said, his voice steady. "About us. About what we're going to do." The three of us sat together, the air heavy with the weight of our shared pain and regret. For the first time, we spoke openly about our feelings, our fears, and the boundaries we needed to rebuild. It wasn't easy. There were tears, moments of anger, and stretches of silence where none of us knew what to say. But there was also understanding, a shared commitment to finding a way forward, no matter how difficult it might be. By the time the conversation ended, the sun was rising, casting a soft, pink glow over the room. We weren't fixed, not by a long shot, but there was a glimmer of hope, a fragile thread that tethered us together despite everything we'd been through. In the days that followed, we started to rebuild. It was slow, painful work, but it was necessary. We learned to talk to each other again, to laugh without the weight of guilt hanging over us. And though the shadows of what had happened would always linger, we made a pact to focus on the future, not the past. Looking back, I know we'll never be the same. What we went through changed us, and there's no undoing that. But it also taught us something valuable, that love, no matter how complicated, is worth fighting for. That even when we falter, we have the power to choose a different path. We're still figuring things out, still learning how to navigate the mess we created. But for the first time in a long time, I feel hopeful. And maybe that's enough. If you were in this situation, what would you do? Could you rebuild those relationships, or would the damage be too much? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more stories that will leave you questioning everything. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next.